All right, so I think this is where we left off, is it right? Did we get through all of that? Pick up right here, transition into the part 2 of this. So it's 1960. And what you begin to see are more examples of direct action protests. Remember, direct action as opposed to litigation is actually taking some action in the streets or in public, typically some form of nonviolent protest, and even more specifically of civil disobedience. In this case, you begin to see sit-ins, not for the very first time, but with some differences from anything you'd ever seen before. Most notably, 4 young men in Greensboro, North Carolina, who were students at a local HBCU, North Carolina A&T, who had been talking it over with family and with their preacher and knew that they wanted to take some kind of direct action, and ultimately settled on a sit-in at the local Woolworths department store. Back then, in the age before shopping malls, every downtown of every small and medium-sized city had a department store or two, Woolworths or Crest, and the sort of hyper-corporatized version of that today is there's a Walmart everywhere, and up front there's usually like a Subway or a McDonald's. Back then, in the department store, typically, there would be off to the side a snack counter, a lunch counter, where you could sit and get a cup of coffee, piece of pie, whatever. Unless you're black. You can go in there and spend your money, if you're black, in the department store, but you could not sit at the whites-only lunch counters. And that's what these 4 young men did. They went and they sat down at the whites-only lunch counter and asked to be served, having already spent their money in the department store. And of course they're denied service. The manager comes out and decides to close the entire lunch counter space rather than serve these young men or make a big scene. What's different about what happens here in Greensboro this time, as opposed to anything you'd seen before, these young men come back the next day and they do it again. And again the next day, and the next. And 2 crowds start to grow. One, they are met with solidarity. Others join them in the sit-in. People who are sympathetic. The 2, an angry mob begins to gather too of white people who are angry about this. And I should add, 3, what was the key to civil disobedience, if you recall? Purposely breaking a law, in this case, a law segregating lunch counters in department stores, establishing a whites-only space, but in order to raise awareness. And so the press is key here too. Photographers, journalists, newspaper writers who show up and cover this ongoing sit-in. And the actions of not just the students doing the sitting in, but the white people who are jeering at them, hurling insults and epithets at them, and eventually doing violence to them. And word of this spreads via the press throughout the South and throughout the nation. And you start to see students organizing. And these kinds of sit-ins start happening all over the South and even in other parts of the country. There are hundreds of such sit-ins in the early 1960s, 60, 61, 62, everywhere throughout the South. And it didn't have to just be the lunch counter at a local department store. You could have sit-ins at any establishment that's segregated. You could sit in at any restaurant that didn't allow black people to eat in that restaurant. You could have a swim-in at a segregated public pool. You could have a read-in at a segregated public library. You could stage a direct action protest at a segregated city park, for example. Any of what we call public accommodations that are segregated by Jim Crow laws could be the subject of a direct action type protest like a sit-in. And in order to coordinate those kinds of actions, the students from North Carolina joined forces with students from Fisk in Nashville and create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. They organized SNCC under the tutelage of an older woman, not a student, but a veteran of the movement, and formerly of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Ella Baker. Ella Baker is pictured here. Again, formerly associated with King's SCLC, but she had left that organization because she considered it patriarchal, if not misogynistic, that is, discriminatory against women. It was all these men preachers, who were also all older than these students, who wanted to have their own organization. One that wasn't necessarily tied to the church, and one that wasn't dominated by people that were a generation older than them. And so rather than joining forces with Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and others in SCLC, they elect to work together and under Baker's tutelage to form SNCC. The two student leaders from Fisk, from Nashville, are that woman pictured bottom right, Diane Nash, and John Lewis. Diane Nash is perhaps the most proactive leader in the early days of SNCC. Certainly becomes the face of SNCC, the former beauty queen who famously confronts the mayor of Nashville directly with a moral question about the moral imperative of ending segregation, and actually getting a response from the mayor that was, surprised a lot of people, I think. John Lewis is from the Black Belt of Alabama, and would go on to be one of the most prolific civil rights leaders of all of American history, arguably. And until his death just a few months ago, was the long-serving congressman from Atlanta, including for a while when I lived there, my congressman. But both of these people, Nash and Lewis, were very young during this time and very energetic and very committed to running SNCC as an organization committed to direct action, of course, committed to civil disobedience, run with democratic principles. There would be no sort of dictatorial style. It wouldn't be like SCLC where there was a sort of headman in the way of King. Certainly most of these people were Christian, but this is not an overtly religious or institutionally religious organization. And it was biracial at first. Not unlike the NAACP, in its early years, in this classical phase, SNCC is comprised of both black and white students working together. In fact, the early logo of SNCC with a black and a white hand clasped together. As we see, that would not remain the case, but for now, that's what SNCC looks like. As you can see in the image at top left, that is an interracial group, white and black students, sitting at a lunch counter in Jackson, Mississippi. And an angry mob of mostly young men jeering at them, pouring shit all over them, and eventually dragging them off the seats and beating them. Anybody been to the Civil Rights Museum downtown Atlanta? You go there, there's a lunch counter where you can sit and put on headphones and hear the insults and the jeers being hurled at you, and you can put your hands on the countertop and feel it in the seat every time somebody kicks you or kicks your seat. And there's a timer up there to like see how long could you sit and endure the abuse. It's pretty moving, even for me being a white guy. And I urge you all to check that museum out if you ever get a chance. What's that?
Is it open?
That is a good question. I don't know if it's open during the pandemic or not. I would say probably not, but speaking to my buddy LG today, apparently the High Museum is back open, so who knows? We'll find out. So you've got the SNCC student-led wing of the movement, and then now you also have the older preacher-led wing of the movement. Institutionally, that's SCLC, led by King, and Abernathy is pictured there. Notably, though, look who is pictured to King's left, our right. You recognize that individual? Very young. It's John Lewis. So this is to demonstrate that in these classical phase years, just because they were separate institutionally doesn't mean that like SCLC and SNCC were like competitors. Although it could manifest that way sometimes. What I'm saying is SNCC and SCLC did work together. Particularly, SCLC's style was to initiate campaigns in certain cities. And as we'll see, SNCC will be a willing partner in a lot of those campaigns. But first, campaign of civil disobedience organized by a different institution, different organization. And that is CORE, the Congress of Racial Organizations. C-O-R-E, CORE, Congress of Racial Organizations. Congress of Racial Equality, I'm sorry. Congress of Racial Equality. I got CORE confused in my head with the CIO, I think. Congress of Racial Equality. Hatches the idea for the freedom rides. The United States Supreme Court, which you know by this time had already handed down the Brown decision, the Browder v. Gale decision in Montgomery, striking Montgomery's segregated bus laws. Brown, of course, being the landmark watershed case regarding public schools and segregation in the South. Well, by 1960, the court had also handed down a decision that indicated you could not segregate in interstate bus travel. You know, the U.S. Congress has the authority to regulate interstate commerce, and you might consider like Greyhound buses or Trailways buses that take people across state lines on long journeys. You might consider that interstate commerce, and those buses stop at bus stations in the South, and this ruling of the Supreme Court indicated you could not have whites-only restrooms, whites-only waiting areas, whites-only snack counters in these bus stations. So note that this is different from the busing issue in Montgomery, which is about segregation actually on city buses in the city. The issue here is not the buses themselves, it's the stations in the South. And so a group organized by CORE of black and white people get on a Greyhound bus and head south from Washington, D.C., through Virginia and the Carolinas, and eventually Georgia and Alabama, with the goal of reaching New Orleans, Louisiana. This was the intended route. And along the way, the bus would stop at these bus stations, and the group of both black and white people would attempt to use the whites-only spaces in these stations, trying to see if the court's decision was being enforced. And in most places, it was not. And of course, they met resistance. Remarkably, though, they did not meet any real concerted, violent resistance until after they had left the state of Georgia. They made it all the way through Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia without any incidents of like mass violence. Until they got to Alabama. And they were not far into Alabama at all before their bus was run off the road by local members of the Ku Klux Klan. Once the bus was run off the road, those Klansmen firebombed it with homemade gas bombs, you might call them Molotov cocktails. And the bus catches fire, and you have to then, of course, escape the bus, at which point the Klansmen beat the riders once they're out of the bus and on the side of the road. Some of them quite badly, needing hospitalization. But the others are determined to continue with the ride, and the bus company sends another bus, and those who had not been hospitalized resolve that they're going to carry on, and the next stop would be Birmingham, the largest city in Alabama. In Birmingham, when they get to the bus station, the Klan is waiting. And the leadership of the Klan had in fact colluded with the local police commissioner to ensure that the Klan would have, I don't know, like 20 or 30 minutes or something like that to beat these people senseless before the police arrived and made a show of breaking it up. So these people were going to get beaten again with no protection from local police by design because the police had coordinated with the Klan. Which, by the way, within the ranks of the Klan doing the beating at the bus station there in Birmingham is an undercover FBI agent. And remember that, that's going to be significant. The FBI had at this point infiltrated the Birmingham Ku Klux Klan. They resolve still to carry on, even though more of them are badly injured. At this point, word has reached Nashville, and members of SNCC determined that they're going to come and act as reinforcements for these core folks, whose numbers are dwindling due to these beatings. And so members of SNCC drive down overnight from Nashville to get to Birmingham to reinforce this group so that they can carry on to their goal of reaching New Orleans. Then they arrive in Montgomery. Montgomery is the capital of Alabama, where essentially the episode of Birmingham plays out again. Except this time perhaps more chaotic, spilling into the streets, people being beaten all over the place, and the real key this time being, among those who get caught up in the melee is a personal advisor to President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had sent a trusted advisor down to monitor this situation, and he gets beaten. And so you know that word is about to go directly to the President of the United States, Kennedy, about exactly what's unfolding in Alabama, which is racial chaos. And the insanity of these white people who refuse to allow these freedom riders to pass through that state unmolested, or maybe not to pass through at all. The president convenes with his brother, who is his attorney general, and tries to find some kind of solution to this. And don't forget that things like this are a major embarrassment for the United States in the Cold War, right? And Kennedy is a guy who, didn't enter office with like grand promises to move on civil rights. He begins to move that direction and certainly will make some giant leaps for civil rights before his untimely death. But you have to consider that part of his motivation in trying to bring about resolution in cases like this is because it is incredibly embarrassing when the Soviet Union is going to plaster this in their state media and mock the United States for its lack of commitment to its supposed founding ideals. So the Kennedy brothers attempt to persuade the governor of Alabama to protect these people, and he steadfastly refuses. And yet a federal court in Alabama issues a ruling. There was a judge in Alabama, a federal judge, who'd been appointed by Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, a Republican, which, remember, that's unusual in Alabama at that time. And he's one of the ones who had actually issued the ruling in the Browder v. Gale case in Montgomery. So he's proven already he's willing to take Brown and make something else of that judicially. And here he issues a ruling that said the state of Alabama must protect these freedom riders. It had an obligation. Now here's a guy, this judge, who was not necessarily a huge fan of civil disobedience. You're not going to find many judges who agree with you breaking the law, but he acknowledges that there's profound injustice, then things like this ought to be allowed to proceed. And the federal judge orders the state of Alabama to do what it can to protect these riders. And so the state troopers, the state police, and National Guard escort the bus the rest of the way to Mississippi, where the Kennedy brothers had prevailed upon the governor of Mississippi to do the same, to make sure that the state police and National Guard protect these riders. But with the understanding that the state of Mississippi would charge these riders with a breach of the peace and trying to incite a riot by coming into their great peaceful state of Mississippi and stirring up trouble. And every single one of them that are escorted, not to the state line and down into Louisiana, but to jail. Into the Mississippi Delta in the northwest of the state, in the old cotton plantation country, to the infamous prison farm known as Parchman, which astonishingly is still in operation today. Rather than post bail, these freedom riders elect to stay in Parchman Farm as a means of protest. Their own incarceration becomes a protest in and of itself. You could call it a jail-in. In fact, subsequent groups would ride down into Mississippi knowing they would be jailed, and they would allow their own incarceration to add to the protest, to the point where they figured they were going to fill up the jails of Mississippi till they couldn't hold anybody anymore. That's why it's the freedom rides plural and not one singular freedom ride. And there is indeed much publicity of the injustice.
So the core is regular people?
Say it again.
I said the core, are they regular people?
CORE, C-O-R-E. It's just another group like SNCC. Mostly younger people, but some that are kind of older, like King Generation, but not necessarily like preachers. So CORE is just a third organization. You've got SCLC, you've got SNCC, and then there's CORE. And they're the ones that organize this, but SNCC ultimately gets involved too. Does that make sense? God bless the PAC people, man. There's nobody here, and they're out there trying to, do all they can. Party and music. fall festival, haunted house, whatever. Are you going to that?
No, like, they're like, if you wanna volunteer.
Oh, they want you to volunteer for it? Oh, wow. Well, yeah, maybe not. I don't know. I might go. What do I have to lose? I mean, you know. So the way that SCLC operated, typically, I alluded to this earlier, is they would target one specific city, you know, for several weeks or months at a time. They would sort of set up operations in that city, challenge its segregation laws. Typically, there would be a boycott of businesses that segregated or that refused to hire black people. They would picket those businesses. They would hold mass meetings in local churches. They would march through the town, and depending on which campaign you're talking about, the campaign could include also efforts to register people to vote. The first such campaign that we'll look at is in Albany, Georgia in 1962. Y'all know where Albany is?
No.
Southwest, yep.
Southwest Georgia. Kind of, I guess, just outside of the Black Belt in the Wiregrass region, almost down towards the Alabama or Florida borders. A relatively small city, but bigger than, you know, just a little town. Targeted by SCLC in 1962, and you would have all of those elements that I mentioned. Marches in the streets of downtown, boycotting businesses, picketing outside those businesses, holding mass meetings, and so on. This will be similar to what we're about to see when SCLC moves into Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, with one very crucial difference. This is the police chief in Albany. His name is Laurie Pritchett. Laurie Pritchett is a thoughtful man. What I mean by thoughtful is he's done some thinking about how SCLC operates, about what civil disobedience is and how nonviolent protest works. He understands what they're trying to do, which is to expose not just the injustice in general, but the violence that whites would employ in defense of white supremacy, in defense of segregation and disenfranchisement. And he instructs his police to be as nonviolent as possible, not to beat these people, not to be overly aggressive in arresting these people. Yes, if they're marching without a permit, we're going to put them in jail, but we'll do so respecting every right that they have. And he orders his police to keep local white people in line and keep them from doing violence to the protesters. In other words, he knows the eyes of the world are watching when the press is there to cover this SCLC campaign, and he can make it look like there ain't nothing going on down in Albany. There's no violence to cover. Everything's perfectly peaceful here. It's like you got guests coming over and you clean up the house and the family's been fighting, but everybody puts on a smile. Act like everything's fine. And the Albany campaign, and by some measure, is a failure, largely due to the shrewd strategy employed by Pritchett. Does that make sense? Using his police force, keeping them in line, keeping local angry whites in line, making it appear while the press is there as if everything was peaceful and fine, when everybody that lived there knew that it absolutely was not. Albany was just as violent of a white supremacist city as any other in the South. Now, some members of SCLC understood exactly what was happening. Among those is the gentleman pictured at top left with Abernathy and King, and that is Fred Shuttlesworth. Fred Shuttlesworth, the preacher in Birmingham, Alabama. Shuttlesworth had been battling Alabama's white power structure, the city of Birmingham's white power structure, for years. He'd been trying to desegregate the schools in Birmingham since the Brown decision in 1954. He'd been engaging in acts of civil disobedience since that time. He'd been beaten to within an inch of his life during that time. He'd had violence done to his family. His home had been attacked, and so on. But he understands what Laurie Pritchett was doing, and he also understood that in Birmingham, they had a public safety commissioner. They had a commissioner form of government, 3 commissioners, 1 in charge of public safety, which put him over both the fire department and the police. And Shuttlesworth knows this commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, was no Laurie Pritchett. He's not that smart. He doesn't have that kind of patience and commitment. He is a violent reactionary, a real reactionary, that guy. The kind of guy, if you're sitting across the desk from him, you pissed him off, you might just throw his coffee cup and hit you in the forehead with it. And so the point here is that Shuttlesworth knew not only is Birmingham ready in terms of through his own leadership, he had generated a protest movement through his church and his community over the years. Not only was the community ready, but 2, you had someone in charge of the police that was no Laurie Pritchett that would not be able to restrain either himself or other people. In fact, remember what I just told you about the Freedom Riders? When they got to Birmingham, the police had colluded with the Klan. Well, the one doing the colluding was Bull Connor. He's the one that allowed the Klan to beat those riders in Birmingham. So he convinces Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and others that Birmingham is the place to launch a campaign in 1963, and they do. In the spring of that year, holding mass meetings, protesting at downtown businesses, asking black people in the city to boycott those businesses because they segregated their changing rooms, bathrooms, water fountains, and they refused to hire black people, and so on. So picketing and boycotting, mass meetings. They would march in the streets, and the city would not grant them permits to march, and so Bull Connor had them all arrested, of course. And here the police are not as careful as they had been in Albany. But they arrest thousands of these protesters, including at one point King himself. This is the moment at which King pens his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. White preachers, white clergymen in the city had written an editorial in a local newspaper saying, "Dr. King, why don't you wait? Why are you here stirring up trouble and causing all this violence?" This is a common theme from white people. That King, all he wanted to do was go into places and stir up trouble and cause violence, and it was really on him. And King's response is, he's not the cause of anything. There have been the most extreme kinds of violence in the South all the way back to the Redemption. All they're doing is exposing it for the rest of the world to see. And to these clergymen, he said, "You want us to wait? Let me enumerate to you all of the reasons why we cannot wait, for we have already waited too long for freedom." They arrested so many people at one point that someone hatches an idea to encourage the school children, the black school children of the city, to stay out of school one day and to have them march downtown, daring Bull Connor to arrest hundreds of school children while the cameras were watching, and he did. And we have these images of little tiny school children being herded into paddy wagons, police vans, and carted off to jail. Kids. At one point, Connor more or less snaps and unleashes K-9 units and the fire department on peaceful protesters in the city's Kelly Ingram Park near the 16th Street Baptist Church, which was serving as the de facto sort of hub of this protest movement or this campaign. And images are captured like this one with a police dog biting a protester. The fire department using not just fire hoses, but high-powered water cannons that would strip the bark off a tree, or in this case, the skin off your back, and you have video or moving images of protesters being literally rolled down the sidewalk in the street by the Birmingham Fire Department, all for doing nothing but gathering in a park. And this news goes nationwide and worldwide. People are appalled at the lengths to which white folks would go in the city of Birmingham just to prevent peaceful protests against segregation and disenfranchisement. The Kennedy administration is also appalled, and to his great credit, Kennedy would eventually go before the nation and present this as a moral dilemma, which is notable because most white people, including those who engage in a settlement here, they say, well, you know what, this is bad for business. Birmingham, this is bad, it makes our city look bad, it makes our state look bad. We need some kind of settlement to get King to leave town because this is hurting our pocketbook. Notice that in that rationale, there's nobody saying, well, segregation might be actually morally wrong. Gee, you know what, this might actually be unconstitutional or not right or unchristian or whatever. They're not saying that. They're saying we should change minimally because it's bad for business. And they enter into a settlement eventually with King. There's some local business leaders in Birmingham, what have been called business moderates, who agree that they will take down the Jim Crow signs, the colored and whites only signs, and that eventually over time they will hire some black clerks to work in their stores. If King will agree to leave town. And he does. Much to the great anger of Fred Shuttlesworth, who was trying to achieve a lot more, including desegregating the city schools, which still had not happened almost 10 years after Brown. Again, to Kennedy's credit, he would go on national television and say what the American people are presented with is a great moral dilemma. And that he presents this issue of segregation and white supremacy as one of that is rather as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution, is the quotation. Old as the biblical scriptures and as clear as our Constitution. And saying that there is a moral right here and a moral wrong, rather than saying, well, it's bad for us in the Cold War. Well, it's bad for business, and so on. And Kennedy will eventually throw his weight behind a major civil rights bill. So for all of his reluctance to support civil rights early on, certainly there is a shift during his administration, occasioned in great deal by what was happening on the streets. Later that year, questions by the way, anything at all? Later that year, two students, through a lawsuit, through litigation, two black students had gained admission to the University of Alabama, an institution that had been all white up to that point. But that fall, Vivian Malone and David Hood were set to integrate, or at least desegregate, the University of Alabama. The man who was governor by this time, not the same as the one who had refused to protect the Freedom Riders. In fact, this man, George Wallace, had lost to that man in the gubernatorial election, in which his opponent had played the race card so much, had basically directed his entire campaign at drumming up white fears of black protest and integration and such that Wallace claimed he would never be out-segregated, or out-segged, that is, using segregation as a campaign tool, or in other occasions said he would never be out-inwarded again. In other words, Wallace, after that, losing that election, claimed he's going to dedicate himself fully to being the segregationist candidate. And he wins. And true to his word, he vows that he's going to, stand in the schoolhouse door and refuse admission to Malone and Hood and keep the University of Alabama white. And he stages a charade, basically, a stunt. agents of the federal government, of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, were with Malone and Hood. They're being protected by U.S. Marshals. They had already registered them outside of the sight of the press and anyone else, but they still had to go into this one building, the Foster Auditorium, for some administrative task, I forget what. And Wallace seizes upon that. They gather up. Look, Wallace is in the middle there. You see he's short. They purposely selected the shortest state troopers possible so as not to make Wallace look tiny. Knowing that the press would be there, all camera, there's a better picture looking out the other way with just a sea of reporters. And they staged Wallace before this podium, knowing that this man, Nicholas Katzenbach, of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, would be there with Malone and Hood trying to enter the building, and Wallace was going to give a speech and stand up there and say, "No, I won't allow you to enter here." Knowing that at the end of the day, it wasn't going to make any difference. Federal power trumps state power in this case. And it had already been litigated. And in fact, like I said, they'd already been registered. So there's really no actual defiant action taking place here. Wallace is just making a scene. Does that make sense? So that people could see him and go, "Hell yeah, George Wallace will stand up for segregation." And certainly that probably scored him quite a lot of points with a lot of white people. But Malone and Hood were going to go to classes that fall anyway. It is at this point that Kennedy gives the speech I was alluding to earlier, where he calls this an imperative as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution, a moral issue that every American needed to deal with in their own heart, in their own mind. And he proposes then a massive and a major civil rights bill that he was going to send to Congress that would address issues like segregation of public accommodations and segregation in schools. And then we have the fall of 1963. Well, once again, another pillorying coming from LG, I feel, for I have alluded to this photograph while it was indeed on the PowerPoint. This is a photo showing you the sea of reporters, and that's just one side. Can you see that? Is it too small? Send Jack to the back. So this is the moment at which Wallace had control of the state National Guard, as any governor would, and he claimed he was going to use the National Guard to keep Alabama integrated, segregated. I'm sorry, and Kennedy federalized the National Guard. This is a power the president has. The president can federalize or bring under his control as commander-in-chief any state's National Guard if he sees fit or necessary. And he did here, so the leader of the Alabama National Guard is forced to stand before Governor Wallace, and he says something to the effect of, "I'm sorry, Governor, it's my sad duty to tell you that you have to stand down." So in other words, he's supporting the governor, but saying, "I'm being overruled here by the President of the United States, and I'm sorry, but you gotta stand down." And Wallace does, and he says, "Oh, I can't fight bayonets with my bare hands." He's always trying to spin something for his own good press coverage. And you can see there are plenty of press there to cover this, and not just from Alabama. So there have been several court cases filed in Alabama by that point that were trying to get the state to finally desegregate its public schools, the K through 12 schools. Shuttlesworth was responsible for one of them. His children were seeking admission to a couple of all-white schools in Birmingham. Finally, by 1963, federal courts had said in these few cases, you must allow these black students to attend these schools in accordance with the Brown decision, which was almost a decade old. And so that fall, for the very first time, a small handful of children in Birmingham and a couple of other cities in Alabama were getting ready to desegregate Alabama schools for the very first time. In response to that, in Birmingham, Klansmen, including some who had over the years engaged in a multitude of residential home bombings when black people moved into white neighborhoods, planted a bomb beneath the side steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church that I mentioned earlier, which had been the hub of the protests during the spring demonstrations. The bomb was timed to go off on Sunday morning when people were there in Sunday school or getting ready for Sunday school, including the 4 young girls that you see pictured at top right, who were in a bathroom in the basement that gets buried in rubble, killing all 4 of them. So now, in addition to police dogs and fire hoses and charades like at Tuscaloosa with the stand in the schoolhouse door, now we have the willful murder of children in protest of desegregating schools. And needless to say, a lot of people are appalled by this. A lot of people lay the blame on the feet of Governor Wallace, who, even as he was standing up and calling for, quote, law and order, meaning, don't do acts of extreme violence, but let's fight against every inch of integration we can in every legal way possible. Even as he was doing that, he was stirring up trouble among the very same people who planted that bomb. And a lot of people knew that. Certainly in Alabama, a lot of people knew that. And so the blame is rightly placed at his feet. And you see the famous cover of Time with Wallace's face superimposed upon the broken glass of one of the windows of the church. And the response of a lot of white people in Alabama was not to stand up and go, well, here it is. Kennedy was right. It's a moral issue. Segregation is wrong if it leads to this. White supremacy is wrong if it leads to this. No. Very, very, very few people admitted that. Even after the murder of 4 children. The response is law and order. Well, you know what? We may not like certain rulings of the courts like these that have said we got to let black kids go to our schools. We may not like that, but it's the law of the land and we got to abide it, and we certainly don't need to be, engaging in willful acts of murder. Law and order. Law and order. Meaning, we haven't given up on segregation or white supremacy. We just don't think you should murder children. You should, work within the law to keep things segregated. Does that make sense? That's the response here of a great many white Alabamians, to double down on this idea of, well, fight it in the courts, fight it in the legislative halls. Don't go out and murder people because that's counterproductive to what we're trying to do. In fact, a federal judge says in court, not all federal judges were pro-civil rights cases. One of them says in court, these bombers were, quote, traitors to their cause. They're making it harder to maintain segregation by doing something stupid like killing a bunch of school children in a church, no less. Questions? These events, combined with an event in November in Dallas, Texas, to allow the administration to push through that Civil Rights Act to become, that Civil Rights Bill to become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In November in Dallas, as his motorcade is riding through downtown, President Kennedy is shot and killed, assassinated by a communist sympathizer named Lee Harvey Oswald. Kennedy's death and the events in Birmingham, particularly the church bombing, allow Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, to push that bill through, despite the longest filibuster in the history of the United States Congress. You guys know what a filibuster is? All right, well, we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'll pull up the part 2 PowerPoint and we'll make sure we know. Questions? Anything at all? Okay. And if I remember correctly, there's a significant amount of overlap here, which means we'll just skip forward. Yeah. Overlap, but with additional information. I forgot about that. All right, well then let's jump back, or do we just want to call it for the day and come back? I don't remember why these changes were made and why it was done as such. This was a year ago. Let's call it.